suppose we've all got different ideas about what constitutes a disaster. Everyday mishaps, personal tragedies, political nightmares, global catastrophes. But by definition, from its roots, a disaster is to be without a star. Dis-aster. The air of impending disaster hangs over today's story from Matthew's gospel. This hovering sense of disaster is born from the reality that most of the people in the story are actually starless. Something I learned for the first time this go-round with this story, or noticed is probably more accurate than learned. Only the wise men see the star. Christmas art, whether famous Renaissance paintings or Hallmark card fodder, often shows the star as outshining all the others. Christmas hymns offer descriptions of the star as having beams so bright, more beauteous than the noonday light, or as a star of wonder with royal beauty bright. But when we listen carefully to the second chapter of Matthew, it becomes clear that this star is not such an obvious and unmissable phenomenon. The wise men came from the east to Jerusalem and announced that they have seen a rising star. But King Herod, a nominally Jewish man serving as a puppet king for the Romans, has noticed no such star. It is news to him that there's something new in the heavens, and news to him that it foretells a new Jewish king. And the creeping feeling of disaster, of being without a star, officially enters the story. At the news of a new king, Herod was frightened. And in one of the most poignant and haunting lines of Scripture, all Jerusalem with him. Don't we all know how precarious our worlds, however large or small, can feel when the person in charge is anxious and afraid? When our leaders are panicky, that feeling pervades, and we all begin to feel uncertain and off-kilter. Herod cannot see the star, and his instability and insatiability colors and covers everyone in his orbit. And then we learn that the chief priests and the scribes also seem not to be caught up in the light of the star. Or, if they are aware, if they have noticed, then like the advisors to the emperor and the tale about the emperor's new clothes, they cower to Herod's petty feelings of insecurity and play along. They do not acknowledge the star. Instead, they quote back to him prophecies about Bethlehem and say nothing about the predictions that include a heralding star. Even when Herod knows there's a star that he should be looking for, he continues to be blind to it. He asks the wise men to do the mapping for him and for his henchmen. The wise men continue to track the star, and now they also begin to track the feeling of possible catastrophe. And because of a warning dream, they withhold the location of the house where the child and Mary were, so that we see the scene of their gift giving and then watch them leave for their own country by another road. What we do not see today in the part that we read, the tragic scenes that follow. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus fleeing in the middle of the night. The arrival of assassins who kill the children of Bethlehem at the instruction of the thwarted and furious Herod. This part of the story ends in disaster for want of a star. But why can't Herod and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the henchmen and the clergy and academics see this star? If this were a story happening today, some answers would be obvious. Light pollution. It's really hard to see the stars in the middle of our populous cities, and even out from town. In most places, it can be hard to pull together a constellation. Or, if you're like me, then the glowing screen I carry around pulls my attention constantly downward, instead of sending my gaze up and around to name the lights above. Who needs to look for real stars when there's a GPS function and news breaking right in my hand? Though Herod and his contemporaries didn't have my screen addiction nor a bright night sky working against them, I do think that these answers as to why we miss things are closer to the answer about why so few people in the story actually see the star. At its essence, this is a question of what we're really looking for. In Herod's rickety position of power, he's attuned to threats and competition, and so that's all he sees. In their desire to appease the king's jealousy and uncertainty, the court watchers and politicians around him only tell him stories that match his narrative, ignoring the wider scope and understanding that they may, in fact, have had. The henchmen, on their murderous assignment, follow the directions given to them without asking any questions, without looking up, without looking into their own hearts. So it's the wise men, then, though they are strangers and foreigners, who are watching for something else. They have studied the skies, yes, but their study has not locked them into one way of knowing. Rather, it has kept them open to noticing even small shifts and occurrences. And so they have eyes to see the star. And they don't respond to this new star arising with denial or fear, but with curiosity and even with hope. And indications are, contrary to the hymns and the art, that the star arising is something maybe not everyone will notice or perceive. It's a smaller, more subtle affair. So if I'm out looking for a blazing, bright, unmissable signal from God, then I'm likely to ignore all these smaller, lesser moments, the tiny glimpses of grace that are all around. And when you and I don't even know that we ought to be or could be looking for anything at all in particular, then our gaze will likely fall unseeing on a world we will mistakenly believe is empty of God's presence. Or when we are blinded by ambition and status, when we're focused on shoring up our own security, we might just miss the pinprick of light that would show us another, more humble way of living. And when it's more important to me to hold on to a story about fear and control, then I will simply not hear the invitation to go somewhere new and give away my precious treasure. I wonder what you and I are really looking for so intently. Or what you and I have long forgotten is possibly even there to be seen, that we don't see then the little flashes of hope that shine all over the horizon of our lives. How much have we missed because we just don't look? There's a good bit of psychology that suggests that we do find what we're looking for. And with this insight, we can train or retrain ourselves to study the world in search of different patterns. So much of the light pollution we live with hides the beauty and goodness that fills the skies. So part of the task is first to remember that the stars are there to be found. Beyond the busyness, the grief, the fear, the selfishness, the confusion, or the other despairing smog effects of life. And beyond psychology, the story of our faith reminds us over and over again that God does show up in our lives, and not always in expected or even dramatic ways, but again and again, rising in new ways, appearing unexpectedly, so that not everyone will notice the same signs. Not everyone will notice at all. It's a true disaster to be without starlight. To believe that all the lights have gone out is a tragic story. Better to live like those wise and generous strangers who found what they were looking for even when no one else around them seemed to believe, because they remembered to look up and beyond themselves. Whether a bright, cascading blaze or a small, flickering light, we keep looking, and when we find it, we follow where it leads.